Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to our seminar series, co-hosted by the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego and the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration. My name is David Fitzgerald, and thanks for joining us today to discuss Refuge, How the State Shapes Human Potential. Before I introduce our panelists, let me share a programming note. On April 22nd at this hour, we'll be discussing Seeking Refuge, Finding Inequality, Refugees Navigating Their Way with panelists Annette Leroux, Blair Sackett, and Catherine Vestaman. You can find information about that April 22nd seminar and the registration link, as well as information about all of our upcoming events at the websites of both of the co-sponsoring centers. In today's panel, we're fortunate to be joined by Heba Gowayed. She is Mormon Simon Assistant Professor of Sociology at Boston University, and she'll be presenting on her book just released over the last 7 days by Princeton University Press, titled Refuge, How the State Shapes Human Potential. Our discussant today is Dagmar Soennecken. She is Associate Professor at York University in Toronto, with appointments in the School of Public Policy and Administration and the Law and Society program. Currently, she's a visiting scholar at CCIS. The order of our activities today is that Heba will give about a 25 to 30-minute overview of the book. Dagmar will give a 10-minute comment. Then we'll throw it back to Heba for a brief reaction before opening it up for a group discussion with everyone on the call today. So at that time, I would encourage you to just electronically raise your hand to be recognized to pose your question live, or if you prefer, you can always use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll pose the question to the author. So with that, Professor Gowayed, welcome, and please tell us about Refuge.
Thank you so much for having me today. And that S you stumbled on, David, was a big decision that we had to make for the title, so we could talk about that too. So today I'm going to be presenting a little bit about my book, which is called Refuge, How the State Shapes Human Potential. And in this presentation, I'm sharing with you the findings of a comparative ethnography that followed Syrians as they began new lives in the United States, Canada, and Germany, countries that offered them resettlement and asylum, which the United Nations identifies as durable solutions to the problem of displacement. And in this project, I focus on the experiences of people who are skilled or semi-skilled, but not highly credentialed, and who arrived to each of these three countries between 2015 and 2016. And I would argue that human capital, typically examined as a crucial determinant of immigrant outcomes, is itself structured through state and corporation policies. Further, I show that this process of production is gendered and racialized. Before I expand on this argument, let me first give you a background on how these men and women became refugees, which is also an explanation of their selection into each of the three countries in this study. The Syrian refugees in the study lived in cities like Homs, Syria's third largest, where this covered market once stood. They became refugees due to a war that began in 2011 as a result of the government's violent response to civil protests for social change, the Syrian manifestation of what came to be known as the Arab Spring. The war took with it the sights and sounds of the neighborhoods where their families had lived, the homes that they had built, and the lives of their loved ones. At first, people fled homes to nearby cities, and then they fled the country. And at first, they fled to countries of immediate refuge, like Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, which continue to host about 83% of all displaced Syrians. And this influx created tensions with residents, resulting in targeting and exploitation of Syrians who did not have legal status in these countries of immediate refuge. So for those who wanted to leave these countries of immediate refuge, there were the two possible solutions: resettlement and asylum. And resettlement, as I'm sure the people on this call know, is where people are selected for travel to a third country based on a measure of their vulnerability. Importantly, when offered resettlement in a given country, they can say yes or no, but they cannot choose the destination itself. Prior to the Trump administration, which is when these refugees were admitted, the United States as well as Canada led the world on admission through resettlement. Still, resettlement globally has always remained a rare solution. Only 1% of the world's displaced people are ever offered resettlement. And for those not offered resettlement who want to move further than countries of immediate refuge, the other solution is asylum. I'm sure many of you remember watching the summer of 2015 as 1 million people, with the help of smugglers, made the treacherous journey on blow-up rafts across the Mediterranean Sea and across the Aegean Sea, or more like it, into Europe. Asylum is where one stakes his or her claim in a country that could offer them legal status by showing up there and applying. And by some estimates, Germany took in about 500,000 asylees between 2015 and 2016, 500,000 from Syria, that is. So by the time that the Syrian men and women in this study had arrived to each of the United States, Canada, and Germany, they'd experienced a number of significant losses. They'd lost their country, arriving to a new one where the adet wa taqalid, or norms and traditions, were entirely different, whose language was not their mother tongue, and where they would be ethnic, religious, and racial minorities stigmatized by association to terrorism. They had resigned themselves to not seeing family for the foreseeable future. But what's more, they would experience a dimming of their potential. In these countries of resettlement and asylum, their skills and abilities, their human capital, did not have the same resonance that they did in Syria. And the focus of this presentation is on why. So the term human capital, Central Studies of Economics, refers to individual abilities and qualities that make workers productive. Sociologists have shown that human capital is an important determinant of immigrant socioeconomic mobility, alongside the characteristics of the receiving context, particularly for first-generation immigrants. In other words, this literature shows that human capital and context together shape immigrant outcomes. Human capital is typically measured, whether in this literature or elsewhere, cross-sectionally as years of education or occupational histories. It's imagined as something that immigrants bring with them, an independent variable that shapes other outcomes. However, this leaves the question. If one had 5 years of Syrian public school education or held an occupation as an artisan in Syria, how does this actually matter for their productivity in a destination economy? This question has been of interest to economists who identify what they call the imperfect transferability of human capital for immigrants who are moving across disparate contexts. It has also been of interest to others who show that migration as a process is disruptive of human capital. Some have tried to explain this discrepancy. Human capital theorists explain it simply as, well, immigrants just must lack the necessary skills. Signaling theorists argue that the explanation of the human capital theorists is insufficient because skills are not a tangible object, right? Instead, they hold that immigrant skills and credentials are illegible to employers because they are foreign to them regardless of the actual skills that immigrants hold. Yet other theorists show that the reading of credentials is shaped by racism, or that the skills of minoritized groups are always seen as inferior. However, all of these explanations continue to center the immigrant as a puzzle piece entering a labor market puzzle. But what of the state, which governs the entire process of migration? In this study, I introduce a theory of state-structured human capital, and I argue, looking at the early period and through a comparative angle, that human capital can be created, transformed, or destroyed through the incorporation policies of receiving countries, which derive from national approaches to social welfare. I find that incorporation systems can intervene in two ways. First, they can recognize or ignore immigrant histories, seeing people as unskilled who may in fact have skills that could be activated. This has always mattered for highly skilled immigrants like doctors or lawyers. But also, I will talk about Amin, who arrived in Germany after working his whole life as a truck driver. I show that this history only matters if the German government recognizes it as relevant to becoming a truck driver in Germany. Second, states can invest in newcomer refugee skills so that refugees can translate their histories in ways that are productive in a new setting or enable them to acquire new skills that matter in that setting. For instance, states can provide language learning classes or teach refugees a new skill that is needed in the receiving economy, but that they did not previously have. States can also provide financial assistance to allow refugees to benefit from existing skill building opportunities. For these reasons, I argue that human capital is not only a determinant of immigrant outcomes, but also an outcome structured by state and corporation policies. I show too that the production of human capital is gendered. As scholars of gender have shown, institutions and services themselves feature expectations for who is a worker. These interact with Syrian refugees' gender expectations, where men are often primary breadwinners, resulting in different, and as I will show sometimes surprising outcomes for women and men. And I show that the production of human capital is racialized. Countries equip new arrivals in their pursuit of a good, stable life through the same racist social welfare systems that have long shaped the contours of national belonging. But what's more, as scholars of race have shown, discrimination and racist violence can diminish possibilities. Here we see it both in the denial of opportunities to minoritized people and through their own fear of being in public space. I'm going to show that this was particularly bad for hijabi women whose identity is more conspicuous in Western contexts. Briefly, this project builds on broader work on immigrant reception. While studies of immigration have often focused on long-term outcomes or how immigrants fit into notions of a national whole, I join others who ask instead how a nation's policies work in the lives of immigrants. I focus on the understudied and crucial initial years in which newcomer histories collide with new systems to coalesce into their first designations of race, legal status, and human capital. This early period is crucial as it shapes immigrants' starting positions in new countries. And finally, I focus specifically on social welfare policies from which social assistance offered to immigrants derives. So what do these social policies look like in the 3 countries that I center in this study? So first, in the United States, we have a liberal market economy that limits the role of the state owing to its treatment of poverty as an individual failure, as argued, for instance, by Michael Katz in The Undeserving Poor. This, as Sibel Fox shows, is inextricably linked to the disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the United States. Refugees' main regular cash assistance comes from TANF, the national welfare system offered to low-income people in the country, which notoriously has lifetime limits and offers low amounts of cash. The goal of TANF and the 1980 Refugee Act is for self-sufficiency, or that low-income people, refugees included, should not be reliant on government assistance for any length of time. Canada is also a liberal market economy, but characterized by what's been called inclusive liberalism. The social service system in Canada is generous, which, as Daniel Zaveri, for instance, argues, mitigates the experience of poverty for Canada's low-income people. This generosity shapes Canadian government's proactive approach to immigrant incorporation, which is also facilitated by other more restrictive aspects of Canada's immigration policy. As Irene Blomrad shows, immigrants and refugees are received through state-sponsored multiculturalism, and Canada actively recruits and seeks to integrate immigrants into the fabric of society, providing both instrumental and symbolic assistance, including the recognition and support of ethnic groups. So it's with this express goal of integration that refugees are met in Canada. Finally, Germany is a corporate system where the national economy is organized by coordination between the state, unions, and employers to the benefit of all 3. The system includes high levels of expenditure on social programs in a highly centralized and powerful state that Meyer-Marx-Spree describes as, quote, producing the nation. This nation was long comprised of ethnic Germans, as Germany has a long history of excluding non-Germanic people from full integration. Syrians entering the system benefit from generous financial assistance from the German state. However, that comes with conditions. One is to learn German. Then, to enter the German labor market, which is a condition of their permanent residency, they need to gain German credentials, credentials which 85% of German workers also hold. As a result, I call the program in Germany one of credentialization. Okay, so how did the newly arrived Syrians experience these systems? Before I get to data, let me give you a very brief note on methods. So to compile the neat data collection chart on the screen involved an ethnography conducted in 3 countries over the span of 3 years. And I have a lot of thoughts on methods. In the longer version of this talk, this section is several minutes long. But for now, what you need to know is that this project was conducted in Arabic, a language in which I'm fluent and native to. Also, regarding the study sample, I chose the United States, Canada, and Germany due to their different approaches to social assistance described in the previous slide. And within countries, I compare refugees from similar backgrounds. So the men were carpenters, truck drivers, chefs, or house painters, working skilled or semi-skilled occupations, but without formal credentials. And women, for the most part, were not employed in Syria. So I'm looking at people who share a similar socioeconomic background and who arrived contemporaneously to each of these 3 countries between 2015 and 2016. And to present my findings, in each case of each country, I'm going to describe how refugees experience their arrival and the assistance they receive from the state. I then describe how each system structured the human capital of the newly arrived refugees and how that experience was different for women and men. And I'm going to begin with the case of the United States and how men and women adjusted to the self-sufficiency imperative of resettlement policy. Here I highlight the case of Roget and Majed, who just 7 years before they came to the United States were a middle-class couple living in Homs, Syria, just around the corner from the cover market that I showed you earlier. In 2010, they'd finally achieved their dream of building their own home, leaving the foundations in place to build additional floors for each of their 3 children, the oldest of whom was a preteen at the time. Their enjoyment of this dream, however, was short-lived. In 2011, they fled to Jordan, where Majed, who had owned his own restaurant, became an undocumented worker at a shawarma stand. The couple, along with their 3 children, arrived in JFK in October of 2015. An international organization for migration van drove them from JFK to New Haven, Connecticut. They were dropped off in a dimly lit parking lot of an off-track bedding facility at the edge of town. They piled into the car of a resettlement agency caseworker and made their way to a low-income neighborhood of the post-industrial city. Their apartment was on the 2nd floor of what used to be a single-family home, and they soon realized that it had a mouse infestation. There, the couple would be visited by a caseworker who would tell them what their assistance would be. During this meeting, they learned about TANF, the welfare system, for the first time. They would receive $803 per month, the benefit of a family for a family of 5. They would also receive a comparable amount in food stamps through an electronic benefit transfer that could only go towards food items. At this meeting, they also learned that their rent was $1,000 a month. Here's a budget sheet for another family early in their resettlement. So because people don't read English, on the left is a clip art of each expense. Each column header is the month, which the family translated into their Arabic names. Yellow highlighter is the welcome money, federal funding, which is a one-time payment of $975 per refugee. And in green is what the family is expected to pay. As you can see, for the first 3 to 6 months, the resettlement agency would help the family pay their rent using a mix of the welcome money and donations to the agency. The family would be expected to pay half of the TANF benefit towards rent, while the agency would cover the rest. But when this assistance was up, TANF cash alone was insufficient to cover the rent. In this family, there was no discussion as to who was going to find a job. As the household's breadwinner, this was Majid's responsibility. And this brings us to the issue of state-structured human capital tied to labor market entry. Majid lacked an effective social network. His friends were refugees who were just as poor as he was. However, through a contact at the mosque, he was referred to an Egyptian pizza store owner. He helped in the kitchen. Majid earned minimum wage at this job, and due to the nature of the job, however, he had no control over his shifts. Though he had tried to attend English class, his work schedule was unpredictable. He did not have the time or energy to study after the shift. Low-income work in the United States is characterized by precarity, with unpredictable schedules, a lack of a living wage, and de-skilling. In Syria, the men in this sample were carpenters, electricians, contractors, chefs, restaurant owners. When they met each other in the United States, they introduced themselves listing these mihan, or occupations. In the US, most worked low-wage jobs, dishwashers, janitors, gas station attendants, where coworkers did not speak English and where they did not have the energy or time to attend English classes after work. As one man put it to me, I want to work, but I'm new here. We just got here. We don't understand anything, but you want to push me to fishuni to work. So we work whatever, hayallah. Most work in restaurants doing whatever. Everyone's working against their will. No one is happy. In other countries, they allow us to study. To get assistance, they say you're not allowed to work so you can learn. Not here. Meanwhile, after the kids enrolled in school, Rajet and the other women began to attend English classes in the morning. By staying out of the labor market, the women had the opportunity to build new human capital. The English they were learning enabled the women to do a series of tasks that their husbands could not. They could communicate with service providers and resettlement agency staff. They could advocate for their children in school, and they were building for the citizenship exam that they would take in 5 years' time. In addition, most of the women within a year after their resettlement also took on some kind of income earning task to support their husbands. The women utilized their skills that they had. For example, Rajet crocheted baby clothes and flower pins, and 26-year-old Gheda, whose husband Zafar had said with finality, "Our wives don't work," did. She prepared sweets, halawat al-laban, and kunafa that her husband sold to other co-ethnics. So in this way, the women reimagined their existing human capitals for new labor market returns. However, as I learned when I began a citizenship class with the group earlier last year, for the women particularly, the gains were short-lived. None of these activities, because they were not earned with a pay stub, were recognized by the Department of Social Services as qualified work. The women could not receive whatever limited federal child care subsidies that were available to them. And as families settled in, babies were born. Sar joked, "Donald Trump is trying to keep Syrians out of the country, but look at us, we're making more Syrians here." With nowhere to leave their children, the women dropped out of English classes. Also, it's important to note that the women were also hindered in their pursuit of language as a result of anti-Muslim racism. So on your screen is a hateful message sent to the mosque in 2016. As hate crimes against Muslims spiked, including incidents against people in this study, they shied away from being outdoors on their own. Gheda, for instance, stopped going to English classes altogether after her family was attacked, and Rajet also stopped going for a period of time. 5 years after their arrival, as a result of all of this, none of the men and few of the women had enough English to qualify for the citizenship exam, a crucial barrier to inclusion and protection against policies like the travel ban that reduce their feelings of security in the United States. So now that I've given you the case of the United States, let me turn to the case of Canada. A drive 500 miles north of New Haven takes us to Toronto, where Denya, a relative of one of the families in New Haven, lived with her husband and 4 children. Denya has a laugh that can be heard ringing down the hallway of her apartment building. Her husband, Bassam, is a good deal older than her, and like Majid, he owned his own restaurant in Hunts. When Bassem and Danya arrived, Costi, an organization that was managing resettlement on behalf of the Canadian government, housed them in a hotel. They would be allowed to choose their own residence. They chose to move to Mississauga, an area with a large Arab community, where a market around the corner that sells the latest in Islamic fashion transplants the customer to an old town souk. Two other families of my studies chose to move to Kitchener and Hamilton with a group of other families, starting a Syrian community out of new arrivals in Toronto, people that they did not previously know. The Canadian government gave the families a startup allowance of $5,000 to cover first and last month's rent. The government also provided new arrivals with standard issue furniture for their home. The family received cash assistance of $1,600 a month, $800 per parent, in addition to the Canadian child benefit of approximately $450 per school-aged child. After their first year, the families who still needed assistance would receive welfare, which was a few $100s less, but still supported the needs of families. The Canadian government, as is clear from their website, anticipated this transition from refugee assistance to welfare. When income support from the government or private sponsors ends after 12 months, in most cases, it is a normal occurrence for some refugees to transition to provincial or territorial social assistance support. And this is a quote from their website. So Danya and Bassam's rent for a 3-bedroom apartment in this high rise was $1,400 a month, which they could cover and exceed with this assistance. So the family did not need to follow the timeline of families in the United States. They could wait to enter the labor market. In fact, they were incentivized to do so by the refugee cash assistance, which they would lose if they became employed. This differently structured their human capitals. It allowed them to learn English and gain skills. Unlike in the United States, where men had to enter the labor market early and women were the only ones who could learn English, in Canada, the opportunity was available for both women and men. Each morning, Bassam and his wife, Danya, attended English classes a short walk from their home. After a year of English lessons, their English remained halting, but enabled them to have telephone conversations, something that neither the men nor the women could accomplish in the United States. And while there was variation in the sample as to who attended regularly, everyone reported that these English classes, as well as other opportunities for education, courses through which people can gain skills or earn diplomas, were free and readily available. However, the system was uneven in recognizing existing skills. While a blacksmith in the study could find work immediately, for instance, a woman who was a nurse in Syria could not. She was told she'd need at least 5 years of schooling to become a nurse in Canada. Both, however, benefited from publicly available and free education. The blacksmith took courses on becoming a forklift operator, and the nurse took classes in community counseling, though she wasn't sure she would make a full career in it. The existence of classes benefited others too. Danya, in her usual jovial manner, said, "Danya that cooks and cleans is over, khalas." She was going to enroll in classes to do hair. So it's important to note that in Canada too, hate crimes were high against Muslims, almost as high as in the United States. However, the families in my study felt in a sense insulated from this hate. Even though ethnography is not a good measure of incidents, this feeling of security says something because it was not the case in the United States or in Germany. One explanation is that the Syrians in Canada, unlike in the US and Germany, had free mobility on where they could go, and many chose to live amongst co-ethnics. They could choose to live in or near cosmopolitan Toronto as well. One could also argue that Canada's active promotion of a policy of multiculturalism and inclusivity by law, which as Irene Bloomrad describes, means that the state, through instrumental and symbolic support like radio programming in people's language, may be contributing to this general sense of belonging. Okay, so finally, what about Germany? So arrival in the German case of asylum is of course more dangerous than cases of resettlement. Iman, along with her husband Amin and their 3 children, arrived in Germany in the summer of 2015. Amin was a long-haul truck driver in Damascus, where he was imprisoned due to tipping off the resistance on a delivery of ammunition. After he was released by the intervention of his boss, the family fled the country. First, they went to Turkey, and then a year later, they got on a raft to Greece. After an 18-day trek through Europe, including 3 days of detainment in Hungary, which Iman describes as the worst days of her life, including the war, they arrived in Germany $400 in debt to someone they'd met along the way. They couldn't afford to travel further to their intended Sweden. After a welcoming arrival in Germany that brought Iman to tears, they spent 2 years in a police camp and then a month in a refugee camp in Leipzig, at which point they secured their 3-year temporary residency. This was a quick turnaround. Typically, the process takes closer to a year. Iman and Amin received assistance from the German government through the job center, where all unemployment and social assistance is distributed in Germany. Their rent in Dusseldorf was covered by the job center, and they received a monthly allowance that covered their basic expenditures and allowed them to send 50 euros home every once in a while. Like in Canada, refugees' language learning is the issue of first concern for the German government. However, unlike in Ontario, Syrian refugees are required to attend German classes under a penalty of a reduction of their assistance. Amin and Iman enrolled in class. In order to secure work in Germany, refugees would have to accomplish at least a B1 level of German. And this meant succeeding in 4 courses, 3 A levels in the first of the B level, which would take a minimum of a year, but more realistically 2 for people who are illiterate in Arabic. The classes also taught basics about German culture and laws. But then, if Amin wanted to become a truck driver in Germany, he would need to do training through an apprenticeship system called Ausbildung for an additional 3 years. His experience as a truck driver and the fact that he had gotten arrested and tortured in prison as a result of this occupation was irrelevant. It wasn't seen by the German government as qualifying Amin to work. In order to find work in Germany, he would have to abide by the same rules as Germans. This made the Syrian refugees feel inadequate. As Gowayed, a 31-year-old former mechanic, said, "The Germans see themselves here," putting his hand up to his forehead. "If you want to get with us, if you want to be with us, then you have to catch up to us. When you get here, it's like you're a newborn." For women and young people who did not have prior work experiences, the credentialization requirement, however, cleared a path to the labor market. Yara, who had married her husband, a Palestinian refugee in Syria when she was just 15 years old, said that she would not have continued education or worked in Syria. "I dropped out of school young," she told me. "I wasn't a particularly good student, and I got married young. In Syria, I just would have taken home of our house and kids." In Germany, however, she said that she wanted to become a dental assistant. 3 years after arriving in Germany, she was finishing up her B1 and in the process of applying for an Ausbildung. However, here too, it's important to highlight the role of racism in shaping the experiences of new arrivals. The image on your screen is of hateful messages one woman received in her mailbox from a neighbor. Not only did new arrivals see the policies of the German state as exclusionary, or as one respondent put it, a German system that works well for the Germans, but also they felt that they were expected to relinquish parts of their identity to better fit notions of German like culture or leading culture. In Germany, where Turks are a substantial immigrant minority, estimated to be 5% of the German population, Syrians are racialized as Muslim in relation to this group that is cast as not wanting to assimilate. Particularly meaningful for their expression of human capital, women were turned away from jobs because they wore the hijab. For instance, a 22-year-old woman was told by a government employee at the job center that she would not work that she could not work in a daycare wearing her hijab because, quote, "it would send the wrong message to the children." So now that I presented my data, I want to conclude by returning to my main argument. This global ethnography centers the experiences of men and women who come from similar socioeconomic backgrounds in their initial 3 years in 3 countries of permanent refuge. It advances a theory of state-structured human capital by showing that human capital, often conceptualized as a determinant of refugee outcomes, is a product of national and corporation policies, and specifically whether countries are willing to invest in and recognize refugee potential. These processes are racialized and gendered because the social welfare systems in each of these 3 countries feature these inequalities, and refugees arrive to them as racialized minorities with their own expectations for men and women's labor. And these findings have 3 main implications, which is what I'll leave you with before I turn it over to Dagmar. So first, in accounts of refugee crises and in international laws, refugees are cast as victims, and receiving states that offer durable solutions are cast as saviors. Implicit to this is the racist idea that life in the West is necessarily a privilege, and therefore countries are accomplishing their humanitarian commitment by simply admitting refugees. But admission into American poverty is no one's salvation. Indeed, wealthy countries that receive refugees, including the United States, Canada, and Germany, are complicit in the colonial legacies, foreign military interventions, and environmental degradations that create the very conditions from which refugees are fleeing. And within their borders, they too are capable of violence. The violence of minoritizing, of denying living wages, of a non-recognition of people's humanity. This project captures how countries equip new arrivals for their pursuit of a good, stable life through the very same systems that have long shaped the contours of national belonging. Second, and following, observing how the human capital of those seeking refuge is structured reveals the ways in which it matters well beyond the labor market. Language acquisition is necessary for everything from making friends to securing citizenship in all 3 of these countries. And the ability to express human potential is emotionally important. How would any of us feel if all we have accomplished and built professionally became meaningless to those around us? Finally, this study has implications well beyond the case of refugees or even immigrants. Through the design that follows the simultaneous experience of people seeking refuge who are strangers to systems of social welfare, we raise a mirror to these systems themselves and how they shape inequality more broadly. National and corporation systems that structure the human capital of refugees are the same systems which low-income people have traversed across these 3 countries for decades, well before this cohort of Syrian refugees arrived. And just as a final note, here is my table of contents, because I chose to do more of a conceptual presentation rather than a chapter by chapter one. So this first one is just the intro. This is how people become refugees, so the processes of resettlement and asylum. And then I have a chapter for each country. And then here and there is how the human, how the way that states shape human capital matters for people elsewhere, right? For family members in their networks. Okay, thank you so much. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Thanks very much, Heba. We'll turn the program over to Dagmar now.
Thank you very much, David, for asking me to be a discussant on this book. And I think considering that the 3 countries in the study are the US, Canada, and Germany, it was such a pleasure to carry this book physically around with me for the last few weeks. And I mentioned to Heba just before we started that this was so unusual because we read so much digitally. So I really, I think carrying it around with me also, I think is a reflection of how much the book drew me in. And in my 4 points that I wanted to raise, I wanted to talk first about positionality and methodology. And Heba said that she took a big part of that out, which is unfortunate because I think that's actually one of the really interesting contributions that this book makes. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then I also wanted to talk about the multi-country, multinational comparison. Again, something I'm very excited about. I think there are not all that many around these days. And I say that as the editor of a journal on forced migration who sees a lot of different kinds of research. So I think it's quite unusual in that respect. And then I want to talk a bit about the writing and the organization and some of the choices, because I'm curious about the transformation process from dissertation to book, and whether you have some recommendations. And then, of course, we have to talk about human capital, the role of the state. And since I know I'm talking to a bunch of sociologists and I'm one of those policy people, and I know I saw some comments by Heba on Twitter about all these policy questions that people ask me. So I will try to get at that from a little bit of a different perspective in my comments. So, but to go back to the first point, methodology and positionality. I wanted to, because Heba does this so beautifully in the book, talk a little bit about my own positionality, because I think it's important as a discussant to respond with that, because it's so critical to who Heba is also in the way that she has access to the people that she accompanied throughout her work. So stories of displacement and resettlement are very close to the way that I grew up, because my mom had to leave her home when she was 5 years old, together with all the women in their family, because the Russian army was coming. And this is, of course, the context of Germany and World War II. But I grew up with stories of leaving home, and I know what it's like to start over. But I'm also a beneficiary of the German dual Ausbildung system that Heba talked about, because that's what I did before I immigrated to Canada. And then I got points because of this Ausbildung, and this is part also of course, my own immigration story. So that's who I am, and I think that is just something that is important as we're having this conversation. But that is also why I really recommended Heba's book to some of my grad students already, because they often struggle with the who are they in conversation to the people that they might want to interview, and how distanced and neutral are you supposed to be? And these are all classic conversations that one has in the committee, but I think the explicit choice to include so much in the book on this, because there's an extra really long appendix, and I think this is what makes this book really fascinating, because there is so much included in this, and I think that's a real contribution that I will try to figure out how to squeeze into my next time that I teach research methods to grad students, because I think that is really amazing, and I can only recommend to people that you check out those sections, because I think that's a really important contribution to this book. I also think it's interesting that you didn't include this in the presentation, but I know you had to go through all of the cases. But my second point that's perhaps connected to this is also when we talk about how dissertations are normally organized, what's interesting is that in the way that you draw the reader into the book, you front load the human stories, and you really have a beautiful way of visual writing. And I think that's why when you were showing all the pictures in the slides, it's too bad that they're not included in the actual book, because you have such an interesting way of making things almost like a movie when you take somebody from the initial life in Syria to then the places of initial displacement and then to their new homes. So I think that's also why this book is so very readable, because I really felt like I was in some of those living rooms and I was meeting the people through the book. And I think that's, again, a really important contribution. And I think it's also really unusual, because in the writing, you make some of the academic conversations very jargon-free. And this is, I think, a real compliment, because it makes the book so accessible. And I think that also allows it for undergraduate students to read it. And again, in particular, in a class where I teach a fourth-year seminar where students are often interested in the comparison between Canada and the United States. So I think this will also be really interesting to draw out some of the conversations also about gender and racialization. And because many of the students at York in my classroom are some of the women that are struggling to choose whether to wear a hijab or not. And so I think that also is something that people make those decisions in Canada as well, and whether they're newly arrived immigrants or people from a different generation. And so that's also why I think this is really interesting that you portray the entire life cycle, because that also, again, from a pedagogical perspective, is a real contribution that we get to learn about the entire story and not just about what it's like when they arrive. And that's, again, the life cycle conversation, what I think makes the book really unusual. In terms of the multi-country comparison, I would love to hear more about Italy and why Italy was not included. And Heba didn't mention this in the presentation, so she ended up picking Germany, and how we all pick our comparison countries. And again, this is how she made the connections then to the colleague in Germany. And I guess we missed each other at York. That's also really interesting, because that's also all discussed in the book. But ultimately, since David, a fellow lover of history, is here, there are, of course, also lots of choices that we make when we present snapshots of certain countries. And I guess I wonder, in terms of the history and the change over time, because you're only able to portray each country for such a short period of time. And incidentally, the US period is the Trump period. The Germany period is that exceptional moment of Syrians coming, and in Canada, I guess, well, maybe Trudeau was exceptional, but I don't know how you would feel about that. But there's so many compromises that one has to make when you include 3 countries, not just 2, and the book is so slim, and there are so few references in there. So I was really thirsting for more of, I don't know, engagement, and maybe like another article that might follow up on some of the themes. In particular, since you mentioned it in the presentation, there's also conversation about crises and resettlement, and of course in the Ukrainian context, and whether you think that there's something different because of the Syrian war and the way that people arrived. Because it did not strike me as something that you were highlighting in the book. So I was curious whether you would see this, the Syrian resettlement, as different from others. And of course, in Germany, you mentioned Turkey, which is not comparable in many respects. But I guess I was just curious because crises get talked about so much, and because we're obviously in another situation right now. In terms of human capital and the role of the state, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the most substantial shifts in the 3 countries, and perhaps the most stubborn areas of resistance. And I'm phrasing it that way to avoid the policy recommendation part, because in Canada, there's a fascinating study about taxi drivers and that you may have run into. So taxi drivers, you know, that's not the place where you get stuck in anymore. The government study said that was only a certain period of time. And, you know, now it's just a transitional. So that was kind of the Canadian government saying, oh, it's not so bad in terms of de-skilling. So I guess I wondered where you see the shifts. And for Germany, likewise, I think, I know so many of the German conversations about how things have gotten shaken up, that system that was built for Germans. But of course, when one reads your book, it's clear that it's just not enough. But again, it's such a short period of time. So I see the whole shakeup that's already happened as a big change. But of course, it still is all of the things that you say it is. And then in the US, I guess I wondered if you see it as retreating even more. Of course, under Trump, that seems sort of an obvious conclusion to me, but it's also the welfare system and the parallels that you draw on the racialization front to impoverished African Americans. And so I guess I was just curious if that's kind of the same old or if it was a lot worse. So I'd love to hear more again about stubbornness and shifts and where you see the most potential for investment than in the three settings. And I think I promised to be short, so I think I will leave it at that and just invite you to speak a little bit more on all those areas, because I think academically we can talk quite a bit more about human capital and investment, but I think there's also so much in terms of methodology contributions that I think are really important. And Mabruk, and I really enjoyed the book and would love to hear more about, and I know you're doing something about NGOs I saw on Twitter, so I'd love to hear what you
my whole life. I didn't mean you couldn't ask me policy questions, Dagmar. I'm so sorry. You know, it was already incredibly kind of you to read this book. And I know with everything else that you have going on, I was just so touched that you agreed to read it, and your comments were just so incredibly kind. So thank you so much for taking the time to read so carefully and for these brilliant comments. You know, since the book was just out on Tuesday, this is a real, you know, it's the first time. So it's really great, you know, to have this and to have you sort of be the beginning, and you're clearly the perfect person. So thanks to David and Roger for picking you, because you have the experience in all three of the countries that that, you know, I worked on. So that's really wonderful. And the positionality, the reason why I took the methods out here is because I spend a long time on methods when I give the longer version of this talk, because as you said, I really care about it. And so every time I tried to shorten it for this shorter talk, it didn't feel like I was doing it justice. And I didn't want it to seem like I was talking about it when I wasn't, but maybe that wasn't the right decision, because as you said, it is very important to me. So of course, I'm Arab myself. I think about, you know, there's that aspect, sort of the, you know, classic reflexivity of like, who are you and your positionality in the field. But there's also other things that I thought about really carefully with this. So, you know, what does consent mean in an ethnography? Is consent something, is it a question you can sort of ask at the beginning? You know, something I say in my methods appendix is that I wouldn't want to read a book by somebody who could help people who are in need and didn't help them. So whenever I could help, I did help. And that has meant that I write myself in, because for the sake of science, I want people reading to know where I did help and where I didn't help, right? Or where, you know, what my impact was or what my relationship was. So these were all decisions that I made. Now, of course, I can't change the structures that I'm reporting on, right? So so there's nothing, and you know, if I could, I would obviously, but there's nothing that I could sort of do about that. But that was a decision that I made, and is something that I write about, and it's something that I do think about writing sort of a methods piece about you know, how to do this kind of research. The other question that you asked that that's really interesting is, how do you get from dissertation to the book? And I mean, thank you so much for your kind words about the writing. But the fact is that you know, my dissertation is really not great. I pushed together some articles, you know, together, and I wrote a front end, and my advisors were not particularly happy with the decision I made. But I feel like as graduate students, there's so much pressure to publish, right? There's so much pressure on writing articles. That I was trying to get those out. And so when it came time, you know, I got a postdoc at Columbia, and I had a couple months to sort of pull something together. So I never wrote my dissertation as though it was the beginning of a book. I did my research for my dissertation for the book, because I always imagined writing it into a book. but I didn't write the dissertation as though I was trying to write a book. And so that's sort of, I don't know if I'm in a position to give advice on that, since my pathway to this was a little bit, based on sort of circumstances, but I didn't. But when I sat down to write the book, I wrote from a blank page. I mean, I wrote from my field notes, and I didn't really use that much from the dissertation. There was some in the American chapter. There was some sort of that I was able to use into the American chapter, but not that much else. And then the last piece, because David asked me not to answer everything, so I'll answer this last piece, which is about compromises. Absolutely, there were so many compromises. So the case of Italy, I have 2 years of data on Italy, and I really, I found it to be fascinating. But the Italian state is highly, highly decentralized. So I found myself reporting on a federal program that didn't exist, right? So the reason why you can write about federal programs in these other countries is because there is one. Now, that was another compromise. What about local and distinct sort of patchwork? And that's what I'm working on now, which is what my question about NGOs, because I'm working on a project with Jake Watson where we interviewed, we started with a sample of all the resettlement agencies in the United States, sent them emails, and interviewed about 40 of, leadership in 40 of them to ask them about local contacts, right? How they're sort of managing this issue of self-sufficiency and the lack of federal funding in their local space. And we saw that, there is a lot of variation locally. Now it's all under the same self-sufficiency rubric, right? It's all under the same federal frame, but there is a lot of local variations. That was another compromise. The historical is 100% a compromise. These are unique moments. I do think that, and this is maybe bleeding into your last question, I do think that, self-sufficiency, credentialization, and integration have been long-standing sort of approaches to this question across all 3 countries, but they definitely look differently. For instance, in the German case, it is a very unique moment, right? I mean, one could argue that this is the first time that Germany has admitted such a large group of people with the express goal of integration and for them to settle, right? Like the Croatians in the 1990s were sent back, the people from the Balkans were sent back. And so this is a very unique moment. And I do think that we will see change in the coming years. So something else I did is that I had an afterword that was written by the people in my book, by one person from each place, because I did the 3 years, and then by the time I was writing, it was 5 years, and I felt that there was like a lot that had happened in that time period that I couldn't account for. So that was sort of another thing that I did to try to account for it. But I think of this I think of this project as sort of a beginning. It's a book that I wrote. I think that it reflects the federal policies that exist in these countries and the experiences of people. But of course, we're going to see changes in how these policies, or I hope we see changes in how these policies are constituted. And to your question on resistance, and I'll end here, I think that thinking about it from the perspective of the welfare systems, makes it so that I'm thinking more about what's staying the same rather than what's changing, just as a nature of just like the framing that I chose, right? Because, you have the dearth of the American social safety net isn't new. It has changed obviously over the last century, but it isn't a new thing. Similarly, the system of integration and multiculturalism in Canada isn't a new thing. And in Germany, we're talking about a Bismarckian system, right? We're talking about like the guilds, right? We're talking about even before Bismarck. So we're talking about sort of a long-standing system. And so I hope we see change, but I don't know that we're going to see a drastic sort of difference from these 3 systems. And with that, I'll stop talking, because otherwise I could talk for another hour.
Thanks very much. And thank you, Dagmar, for that comment. I should have mentioned that, as you alluded, Dagmar is also the editor of Refuge, Canada's journal on refugees. So yeah, at this time, if anyone has questions, please raise your hand and pose a question to Heba or to Dagmar as well. As we wait for questions to come in, let me just begin with one question, which is that in your overall argument, Heba, you said that human capital plus context produces these outcomes for immigrants, that process is gendered and racialized. So how much of that particular argument is specific to refugees as opposed to all international migrants?
somehow I'm sorry. I don't think it's specific to refugees. I think it's specific. I think it is definitely applicable to other people who are moving from place to place. I also think, honestly, and this is something I do think about, and speak on in the book, that it's just true, period, right? Like these recognition and this investment that we have is true for all of us, right? Some work that I cite, for instance, that I reference is Diva Pager's work, which shows that, you can have all the skills and abilities, but you might go to an employer, and because you're Black, they don't give you the job, right? And so there's something about here that I think is more generalizable than the case of refugees. I do make that argument, maybe not full-throated in the book, but I do sort of allude to the fact that I think that this has legs maybe beyond this specific case for sure.
Okay, we have a question from Molly Fee.
Hi, Molly, thanks for coming.
Yeah, congratulations on the book. So I wanted to ask a question about how you see time playing into the development of human capital, thinking mostly about the cases of the US and Canada. So it seems like from your presentation, Canada sort of front loads the investment in human capital with then the returns coming later, whereas the self-sufficiency model in the US really pushes early employment with the promise of later career development. And resettlement agencies often have sort of vocational training programs and credentialing programs that happen kind of maybe a year, 2 years, 5 years after resettlement. And so I guess my question for you is whether you think that the US model of putting human capital development after employment actually really does anything to support the skills of these arriving refugees, and if there's sort of instead this inertia that happens once refugees arrive, especially parents, their primary task is paying rent and providing for their families, and if these later opportunities kind of end up being meaningless.
Yeah, so I would answer this in two different ways. So one is that and this is important to note, is that I'm thinking about this very much as these are sort of the systems in place, and people can have great outcomes despite these systems, right? So I'm thinking, so I definitely believe in agency, right? And so within these very systems, people sort of try to fight back and try to create a space for themselves. So people, in the United States, for instance, they try entrepreneurship, they try their hands at different things, and sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't, right? But it's within this framework. So it's despite the system is how I would sort of answer that, which is one way of answering your question. The second way of answering your question is that there is some evidence that entering the labor market, so what I'm seeing is that entering the labor market early, it's very, very difficult to work your way out due to the nature of the American labor market system, right? So even though refugee resettlement agencies have this narrative that it's like an upward mobility narrative, that you're entering the ladder of the American economy and you're going to climb your way up, just like we see with everybody else, right? If you're working a low-income job and you're not recredentializing and you're not gaining any other kind, you're not gaining windfall, there isn't like an investment in you, those aren't jobs that you can work your way out of, right? Like, I mean, Arnie Kohlberg's classic sort of thing is like, the polarized labor market and the difficulty of sort of working one's way up, and the myth of the idea that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And there's also data, and I can pull it up for you for the actual numbers, but maybe we don't have time for that. Oh, here that is. But there's also data that shows that refugees in the United States have much worse, 10 to 20 years later. And this is obviously earlier cohorts, so they wouldn't have been in the 96 welfare system, so they would have been in the previous sort of format. But earlier cohorts have lower language retention than refugees, for instance, in Canada, so lower levels of language ability, of English ability, and also that they have that they don't end up having sort of similar or comparable incomes in the way that in Canada, refugees tend to have comparable incomes to other immigrants and other Canadians. And so we do see that it does have an impact in that way in terms of language. But in Canada, you have very low levels of, in Germany as well, very low levels of employment in the original years, in the first couple of years of arrival. In the United States, you have very high levels of employment, right? So it is, I think, very much a trade-off in terms of whether you enter the labor market earlier, whether you have this time to rebuild. Thank you for your question.
We have a question from Hiroshi Motomura.
Hi, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.
what I was going to ask about, I mean, David already asked maybe a third or half of my question, so I just want to build on what he was asking about. I was thinking about putting your project in a broader context, both from analytical and policy perspectives. And there's really two topics here, I think, that are implicated in David's question. I mean, one is your analysis of the reception and integration of refugees, right? And the other is the fluidity of the definition of refugee and skepticism of the binary between refugees and migrants or other migrants, depending on what term you want to use, the opposite of refugees. And so, so he was asking about whether the lessons that you draw for refugees also apply to immigrants who might be outside the definition of refugee. And I think I heard you to say that they do apply, but I want to hear more about why, or how you would show that, or how you would go about or design, at least analytically, how to think about that question. And I also want to ask a question that is really more the policy side of this, I suppose. I guess it's a policy question. Sorry, I mean.
Everybody can ask me policy questions.
I'm sorry, I'm a law professor, so it's all I can do.
Please.
But if refugee is more broadly defined, how would that modify, dilute, or even jeopardize the current practices of reception and integration of refugees as they exist? The positive. I mean, what's the nature of the precarity of current practices that you saw, and how might a refugee be more broadly defined to go in the direction that you suggest would be proper, to expand to more than narrow definition of refugees, but at the same time to maintain that reception? So it's really, two questions, but in a way they're just asking you to elaborate both on your answer to David, but also to comment on the political precarity and perhaps the dependence of the treatment of refugees on a narrow definition of refugee.
100%. So I am, my new favorite article that exists out in the world is actually, I think, from a UCLA professor, if I'm a UCLA law professor, I think she's at UCLA, Tendai Achiume.
Yeah.
Who I think, yeah. So she, so her work on migration as decolonization is excellent, and I think gets to the central sort of core of this, right? If we think about migration as a form of reparation, if we put it in the colonial context, if we think about human mobility as natural, right, in all these different ways, and so I'm drawing on her, I'm drawing on other people's work here when I make this comment. I think that we cease to see refugees or the designation of people as refugees as sort of this this moral marker, right? That these people are worthy of support that other people aren't worthy of. So I would completely agree that it's an arbitrary designation. A racialized designation often has to do with geopolitics more than it has to do with any individual's reason for fleeing. And of course, as you said, right, that does shape the kind of assistance that they receive here. So one of the things that makes the case of refugees so interesting to compare is because in the United States, we don't have any integration assistance for any other kind of immigrant, right? So we have refugees are really singled out for access to welfare, right, which is denied other categories of immigrants. For access, I mean, food stamps, some food stamps, it gets a little bit more blurry, but definitely for welfare assistance and for the welcome money and for the match grant and for all these kinds of assistance that are designated to this group. And so in that sense, I feel like the case of refugees is a conservative case to think about this multinational comparison, at least from the perspective of the United States. Because if we think about, recognition and investment as something that matters for everyone, certainly that matters for all immigrants, then what does it mean that the vast majority of immigrants arriving to this country are receiving no investment, zero? And that this is our system, and that for these refugees, right, that our system is the same system that addresses the needs of low income people in the United States, or low income Americans specifically, and that this is sort of the same system that's failing them as well. So that's kind of how I would answer that, and I do think that that the two questions that you asked are related in that way. Thank you.
Dagmar.
I just wanted to add to the migrants versus refugee aspect, because I think what's there in Heba's book and that she hasn't emphasized yet is that the key difference is, of course, trauma and the services that are offered to some refugees. And again, this depends on the context and on when people are labeled and identified as such. They might come to Canada, for example, through the resettlement stream, and they might get extra counseling, healthcare services. And I think that is, of course, also what then may delay their entry into the labor force. It might make it so much harder for them to go out there. And then, of course, the American case is interesting because that does not matter, right? It's really you still have to get out there and then deal with your trauma, your whatever happened to you. And I think that's also, it's just, that's the crucial, I think, distinction for me. And since I'm on this project involving vulnerability, that's just at the front and center for me, because I always tell my students, well, many refugees have the same skills as other immigrants, and that's important to look at them that way, that they just happen to, be forced to move somewhere else. So they are like other migrants, but the trauma aspect, I think, is really critical also in the human capital, because it's so, like, the overall health and well-being is, I think, really important to starting over, and people are so resilient and can overcome so much. But I think, again, in terms of services and investment of the state, I think that's where Heba also shows that there's quite a bit of variation on this particular aspect. So on the part that makes people unique who come under these circumstances. But that's just,
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that, so right now I'm working on a new project that is about mobility of people across like borders between the global north and global south. So like, talking to people about the costs of their journey specifically. And this emerged from Refuge. It emerged from talking to people about, how they got from Syria to Germany, which required them to take a raft, put their children in danger, pay a smuggler. They had to leave the smuggler fee with a broker. And then they had to make all the way up through Europe, hiding in jungles, etc., risking detention. And it got me thinking about, all these expenditures that are paid to get across borders and all the expenditures that states are paying to maintain borders. And this variation in border permeability, year to year, sometimes month to month. And it got me thinking about borders sort of as a transaction, right? That there's nothing sort of no moral marker to this, but that they're, thinking about them as sort of this, jostling of costs in order to maintain that marker. And something that I've done with that is I've been doing these in-depth interviews in Greece, and I've been doing in-depth interviews with people who are showing up in Greece, and I don't ask people if they're refugees or not. I just, do the interviews with them because they have made this journey. And I would say that trauma is, for somebody who's moving undocumented over a border, trauma is a major part of the story, right? Regardless of whether the state classifies them as a refugee when they get there or not. Whether you're fleeing from gang violence, which we know is not, necessarily classified as a refugee, if you're fleeing from climate degradation, if you're just escaping from poverty, right? Poverty can also be highly traumatic. So I think that there is something about trauma that, that shapes the immigrant experience of marginalized groups and of people who are moving across borders, whether or not sort of, regardless of their legal categorization, I guess. But I do agree with you that trauma is a major part of this, I think.
Roger, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. So, one of the, and this may be something that you discussed in the book, but I didn't pick up in the presentation. Obviously, one of the differences between Canada and the United States on one hand and Germany on the other is that the Syrians who made it to Germany essentially self-settled themselves there. They were the ones who decided who was going to go, and that, to the best of my knowledge, is reflected in a very significant disparity in the characteristics of the population. That is, it's much more heavily male, and relatively speaking, there are fewer females. There are fewer families, excuse me. And so, and in general, the U.S. resettlement system tends to favor the resettlement of, people who, people whose conditions leave them more fragile and more vulnerable.
Sure.
And so therefore, to begin with, arrive with greater difficulties, of course, compounded by the cruelty of the resettlement system that you've described. So, if you think about that contrast between, on the one hand, a self-settled population that has very different characteristics than a resettled population, I have two questions. One, isn't that itself an aspect of the context? It's not simply the social welfare system, but also the characteristics of the broader refugee population and the resources that they bring to bear. And the second is, to what extent is a story that you tell about Germany one about families, or does it include the very large population of people who didn't come with families. And if it's a family story, what are the implications for those who came as solo individuals?
Yeah, great question. You're absolutely 100% correct, right? So people who got to Germany look very different on the aggregate than people who came to the United States and to Canada. And that's because, as you said, right, you have to get there, right? And so, and in a lot of cases, a lot more wealthy people also arrived in Canada. So for instance, in Berlin, there's a street called Soennecken, which used to be, and I really apologize to the German speakers here. I don't speak German, so I'm probably butchering them. But, which used to be sort of an enclave, an Arab enclave that's become now, a Turkish enclave that's become now a Syrian enclave, right? And people have like come with a tremendous amount of capital and open businesses there. So that exists 100%. What I've done here is I've matched. So I've looked at, in the case of Germany, so in the case of Canada and the United States, as you said, they're selected on the vulnerability assessment. They're actually selected from the same lists. So that was, people were pretty similar in the two places. In the case of Germany, the places that the people that I report on in this presentation, and to an extent in the book, are people who come from similar backgrounds but did arrive in Germany. That said, I do also have the cases of people who were single men who arrived, and also cases of people who were wealthier. Now, before I get into that, something to know about the German cases: yes, people did arrive as single men in the beginning, but but a lot of them came with aspirations to reunite with their families. So the reason you see a lot of single men is because it's very, very dangerous to make this journey. So people would make the journey and then they would apply with the German government to reunite with their families. So right now, about 1% of the German population is Syrian as a result of that. I might have to look up the makeup. I think it is still leans male, but not to the extent of people when they first arrived. So the way I would answer that question is to say that the recognition investment actually gets, the recognition issue actually gets worse. It can be worse for people who are highly credentialed, right, and who are wealthier, who are arriving. So take, for example, like, I spoke to Syrian lawyers, I spoke to Syrian, to Arabic teachers and to translators, and also to a Syrian doctor. So the doctor, for instance, was a very high, he was retired. He was like a man in his, late in his maybe early 60s, and he had retired. He had sort of sold his practice. And when he got to Germany, and he also had training in like Russia. So when he got to Germany, he tried to sort of become a doctor there because he had to find work. And he had to learn the language. He had to take 3 years. And then he started sort of at the bottom of the distribution. I mean, I don't know what it was called, but sort of as an apprentice, as like a beginning doctor. And he had to move to a rural area in order to work. And that was really hard for him because he had sort of established his career and his practice in Germany. And, the lawyer, for instance, didn't end up being able to translate his credential. He ended up having to work in a car manufacturer on like a short-term contract. So he wasn't even really getting into the credential system, kind of left him really marginalized. And one of the Arabic teacher, she also couldn't work in Germany because there was no jobs for her and there was no way to translate that. There is a system in Germany for the highly credentialed people called, it's part of the Recognition Act, which was amended, which was passed sometime in the late 2000s and then was amended again as these Syrians were arriving. And it's really fascinating because when you go to their website and you look at actually who they recognize, so they are very likely to recognize people from the European Union who migrate to Germany. They are very unlikely to recognize Syrians. It was almost like a 20% recognition rate. And the reason that they have is that they say that credentials of people from places that are more culturally proximate, and I do have this quote in my book in the beginning of the Germany chapter, were more easy to recognize. And so even they are not saying that it was a discrepancy in skills, they're saying it's an issue of cultural proximity. So there's certainly a bigger story to tell here. And I think actually at the higher end, it can be worse for people who were professionals in Syria who ended up just experiencing incredible loss.
Okay, but just to follow up, I mean, if then maybe, let's say, the modal or a significant fraction of the population has the experience of initial migration as a solo male and later family reunification, presumably that family reunification takes place with a considerable time lag. Doesn't that significantly mitigate the disadvantages? I mean, in the end, first of all, many of the problems of the families resettled are due precisely to the fact that the families are so large, there's so many mouths to feed, it all happens very suddenly. But in the case of a single male, there's only one person that has to be housed, only one person has to be fed. And of course, there's a family back home, but the family back home gets remittances, which go a lot further than with the same amount of cash in the country of destination. And in many ways, that makes it much more similar to the typical immigrant trajectory.
So I'd answer this in two ways, right? The first way is to say, when you arrive as a single man, you receive substantially less state assistance because it's based on family size. So single men have harder time with the system than families. But the other way I'd answer this is that, I mean, integration is not just about money, right? It's about like feeling like you're a full human being, right? If somebody's unwilling, like if you, Roger, were to go to Germany and nobody was willing to recognize anything that you had done, none of the books, none of your titles, nothing, it would be a terribly jarring experience, right? So like, I think that expanding our understanding of what that experience is, right? And what human capital means beyond just its economic return, right? Is a crucial part of this story. To me, or that's what I argue.
Sure. Okay, I mean, this is a very displacing experience without question.
Yeah, and I think that if they wanted, like, if there was a better system for recognition, right? So there is 100% the family story. Also something that maybe I didn't mention in this version of the presentation is that it's also important for residency. So there's a lot of precarity. There's a lot of a sense of precarity because in the German case, so initially, so there's two different ways that you can get status in the European Union and in Germany. One is a 3-year asylum. One is recognition for asylum, in which you get a three-year renewable, and the other is subsidiary protection. Now, the recognition with asylum, you actually can reunify your family pretty quickly, right? If you get that, you're able to submit for reunification, your family comes pretty quickly within a matter of months. But they ended up, so in the first year, in 2015, when Angela Merkel had suspended the Dublin regulation, a lot of people were being recognized vis-a-vis asylum, and a lot of their families were coming like quick. But when that happened, the German people, the German sort of policymakers got frightened and they worried about the number of people that were coming in. And so they shifted and they only gave people subsidiary protection, which is yearly renewal. So people were really, really concerned that if they didn't enter the labor market very quickly, that the Germans would say, well, you're not productive in this economy, and therefore they wouldn't renew them. And so this is sort of another layer of why people wanted employment for legal status reasons, but also just for sort of emotional, people want to feel like they belong.
Okay, we have a question from Crystal asking if your research touched upon psychosocial well-being or mental health issues.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I have a lot of footnotes on that. I ended up not addressing it directly because I didn't feel qualified to address that because the mental health issues were, I was interpreting, for instance, on an arrival, and a woman was seeing things that didn't exist, right? Like there was a lot of, there's a lot of PTSD in this population. Somebody went, there was a man who began to exhibit symptoms of epilepsy, or like what looked like epilepsy, and it turned out it was all psychosomatic and had to be hospitalized. Particularly when Trump won the election, there was a lot of people who were hospitalized with mental health issues because that was triggering and people felt unsafe. So definitely mental health is a huge part of this. Spoiler, maybe not spoiler, mental health treatment is really poor in all three countries. And so it was very difficult to find consistent mental health. I experienced this most often in the United States. And one of the major issues was translation. So if you get a different interpreter every time you enter a psychiatrist's office, right, it means that you're not getting sort of a consistency of treatment. There's also, Arabic has a lot of dialects. And if you are trying to speak to somebody who doesn't have a dialect that's proximate to you about a mental health issue that's really vulnerable, it can be very, very difficult. And so those were the kinds of issues that I saw with mental health care, and similarly also in Canada. And in Germany, there was a lot of medication, offers of medication, but not very much sort of access to mental health treatment. So that was a major dimension of this. The other thing I'll say about mental health is too often when we talk about trauma or when we talk about mental health when it comes to refugees, we assume that the mental health issue comes from the war, right? We assume the mental health issue comes from, fleeing the persecution. But what I observed is that the displacement in and of itself, the feeling unheard, the feeling like you don't belong, experiences of racism, something like Trump winning and feeling like, you're unsafe, that can also be massively triggering and traumatic. And I think that, you could think about displacement as sort of a continued accrual traumas, rather than sort of a trauma that existed before that people are carrying with them to the destination country.
You know, on your last point, the subtitle of your book is How the State Shapes Human Potential. And I wonder if that's inadvertently letting the broader society off the hook a little bit too much. I mean, you had that really compelling anecdote that you shared about the family that was trying to learn English, but because they were in the socially hostile environment, my understanding was that they were less likely to go out and kind of practice with strangers, for example, because they didn't want to expose themselves to some kind of hostility, which would then retard their ability to speak English, which is an important component of human capital. So showing that mechanism, I think, is really useful. But I mean, how much of this is actual, government policy versus a broader social reaction that's shaping levels of human capital?
I would say that my answer to that, I definitely, the society plays a role, but I would say that, I don't think it's natural for people to hate people who arrive. And we know this, for instance, with refugees specifically, right? We know that refugees were not, I'm old enough to remember when refugees were not a controversial political issue, right? It came through churches, right? Likened to Jesus. This was not an issue. They were actually seen as worthy and like this special category of immigrant, right? Even people who were anti-immigration in other ways liked bringing in refugees. So I think that, what we're seeing here is a politicization, and the reactions actually that people had were after the travel ban, and were after their children were called Trojan horses for terrorism by the Trump administration. And we know, for instance, from other work, that fringe ideas, right? Fringe political ideas can become centered when they are sort of, I think it's Stephen Basie's work Bale, sorry, that, as they're repeated, they become more central, right? And so I would say that, yes, sure, obviously there's the social aspect, there's employers, and we know this from the immigration literature, but I feel like what I'm adding is this idea that the state is playing this crucial role in shaping the experience and through the recognition investment in human capital, but also through the politicization or not of this group. I think it can't be discounted that, Trudeau ran on a platform of admitting 25,000 Syrians, and then when they arrived, meeting them at the airport. And there's a lot of criticism there that you can make of Trudeau. There's a lot of criticism that you can make of the immigration system in Canada, but that definitely shaped how they were received also by Canadian society, right? And how Canadian society also, and the other thing I didn't talk about is private sponsorship, which is a huge also social lever, where people felt like they had a stake, they could be involved in the resettlement of refugees. So that was another aspect there too. And I think that these policies do matter for how society sort of reacts to the arrival, whether they're politicized and othered, or whether they're seen, whether it's sort of seen as a citizen's obligation to support them.
Well, thank you very much. I think we are out of time, but congratulations again on the publication. Thanks for sharing with us in the very first week that it's on the shelves. As you can see in the chat, our next event is going to be on April 22nd. We'll continue our discussion of resettled refugees, this time focusing on the US case with refugees from Uganda. And we hope to see you all on that call as well. Thanks again to Dagmar as well for her incisive comments, and I wish everyone a happy weekend.
Thank you all so much. This was incredible. I really, really appreciate you all. Thank you, David. Thank you, Roger. And thank you, Dagmar, so much for inviting me and for making the time and for reading my work. Thank you.